Every year, UK investors lose thousands, not necessarily from bad investments, but from ISA mistakes they're making, and many of them don't even realise it until it's too late. So today, I'll share with you some of the biggest traps to avoid, along with some tips and tricks along the way, so you can keep more of your money working for you. Quick disclaimer though, this video is for educational purposes only and is not financial advice. Nothing within this video is an investment recommendation. Always do your own research, and when investing, your capital is at risk. Across the UK, 22.3 million adults hold an ISA, but only 16% of those ISAs are stocks and shares ISAs. When it comes to the nation's personal finances, we have a huge preference towards cash over than that of making investments, with the exception of 2021 being the outlier for deposits. And whilst it's easy to understand why, because of complex financial jargon along with risk disclaimers splattered along all kinds of financial products, like your capital is at risk and the value of your investments may go up as well as down, it's completely understandable as to why most people prefer to hold cash, because, well, we all understand it, along with it has this perception of being safe. But there is equally a risk with holding too much cash, because the value of a pound gets eroded over time thanks to something called inflation. Consider this, over the last 5 years, the average stocks and shares ISA has a return of 6.37%. versus that of an average cash ISA return of 2.07%. But here's the problem. When you layer in the average inflation rate of 4.29%, you can hopefully see the issue here. With the cash ISA, your real wealth is decreasing, with the stocks ISA being the account that has the potential to beat inflation over time and therefore grow your real wealth too. For me personally, I use both. I've got my cash ISA for my emergency fund along with some additional cash savings too, but then I put the bulk of my savings, if you like, into my stocks and shares ISA, and I invest that money for the long term. Now, I've got links to the ISA providers that I use who are also partners of this channel, and I'll leave a link to those down in the description below. But for the cash savers of you out there, there is a tax trap that many fall into because they're not using the right account. So let's talk about that next. An ISA stands for Individual Savings Account, and it's a type of account that gives you tax-free savings, or at least based on the current ISA rules, as long as the government don't make any changes. Now, one hugely beneficial reason to use the cash ISA is that any interest earned within that cash ISA is not subject to tax. Now, the reason why I say that is because we've most recently been in a climate of higher interest rates, and because of that, you can get easy access savings accounts that are offering very much attractive rates of interest. However, depending on your income tax band, your personal savings allowance, which means the amount of interest that you can earn on your money, is actually capped at £1,000 for a lower rate taxpayer, £500 if you're a higher rate taxpayer, and £0 if you're an additional rate taxpayer. Any interest that's earned over these personal allowances that are sat outside of that tax wrapper of the individual savings account are obviously subject to tax and can be clawed back by HMRC. In my opinion, this makes the cash ISA an attractive place to put money in order to earn that interest without having to be worried about paying any future interest to HMRC if I'm over that of my personal allowance, especially if I'm not yet using up all of that £20,000 allowance that I'm allowed to deposit into my ISA on any given tax year. One of the common misconceptions, is probably because of most recent historical ISA rules, is that you can only have one ISA account of any given type, but that's not quite true. The actual rule is that you can save up to £20,000 per tax year in any given account, or split that £20,000 into multiple ISA accounts, where the tax year runs from the 6th of April to the 5th of April. Now, of course, that's an example of splitting that allowance across the 4 different ISA types that are available. However, what if you end up in a position where you have multiple accounts of the same ISA type? Well, let's say that you have a stocks and shares ISA with Vanguard, but you want to move over onto Trading 212. Well, in the past, you could only pay into one provider per tax year, but the rules are now that you can pay into multiple accounts in the same tax year. So say if you paid £5,000 into Vanguard between April and August, but you now want to change over to, say, Trading 212, you can open an account and pay in the additional £15,000 into Trading 212 until the end of the tax year. It's absolutely up to you how you split that £20,000 allowance across multiple accounts of multiple account types, but you just must ensure that you don't exceed that overall £20,000 deposit limit. Of course, that becomes more difficult with the more accounts that you have, but if you have realised that you may have deposited more than £20,000 across all of those accounts, then it's probably recommended that you contact that ISA provider to let them know and get some guidance, or even just contact HMRC, and I'm sure they'll point you in the right direction if you owe any tax on the additional deposits that you've made. One thing to always bear in mind, especially when you're investing in a stocks and shares ISA, is to be mindful of the fees that you're paying. Fees can be anything from account charges, management fees, transaction fees, and the brokers will usually publish a list of their fees over on their website, which is important to look at before you open an account with them. Now, the reason why I call this out is because the impact of fees on the future value of your investment portfolio can be absolutely huge. Check this piece of research out, which was done by Vanguard, where they show what a £100,000 investment could look like after 30 years, assuming hypothetical returns of 6% per year. At an average fee cost of 0.1%, the portfolio would be valued at £557,383. But with fees of just 2%, the portfolio would be valued at just £317,081. That's an investor who's lost 43% of their portfolio value just in fees alone. So be sure to keep your fees to a minimum, because if you don't, it could hurt your long-term retirement plans in a few decades' time. One thing to check out for the ISA that you're using is whether that ISA is a flexible ISA or not, and it should clearly state this over on the provider's website. Now, the benefit of a flexible ISA is that you can take money out and put money back in within the same tax year without using up any more of your allowance. Meaning, let's say that you paid £10,000 in, but then you withdrew £2,000 because you needed the money for some reason, and then you put that £2,000 back in at a later date within the same tax year, you will have still only used £10,000 of your allowance. This is also useful when you're moving money between ISA accounts, which is something that I regularly do over on Trading 212, where I'm moving my money from my cash ISA into my stocks ISA to be able to invest it. If you want to buy American shares as a UK resident, then the US government will charge you tax on any income that's generated from those shares, usually from dividends that you've received. However, to avoid paying some of that tax, you can complete something called a W8BEN form. The W8BEN form allows you to benefit from the tax treaty that the UK have got with the IRS, which means that any withholding tax on dividends is reduced from 30% down to just 15%. Now, you haven't got to worry about paying this 15% directly to the IRS because it's taken at source. However, one thing to be aware of based on most recent developments is that as part of Section 899 of the Big Beautiful Bill, the Senate, and I'm going to quote this, are looking to increase the US federal income and withholding tax rates on the income of foreign persons in jurisdictions that have adopted extraterritorial taxes by 5% per year, up to a 15% maximum increase. So I guess in a way for us here in the UK, it's kind of like reversing the benefit of that tax treaty. Now, this proposal was made a couple of months back, but as far as the research that I've done for this video, I can't see whether it's been passed or not yet. So for now, that UK withholding tax rate remains at 15%, but do bear in mind that could potentially change in the future. On the topic of taxes, one thing to mention is that the stocks and shares ISA isn't completely tax-free when you are buying UK shares. If we use the Trading 212 app as an example, let's just look at UK stocks. Let's click into Rolls-Royce and let's assume that we're going to buy £100 worth of shares. You can then see that there is a stamp duty charge of 0.5%. This essentially is a tax applied by the UK government on the purchase of all UK shares. In my opinion, it's a bit of a pointless tax. It just kind of creates additional barriers to disincentivize investing, but it's a tax nonetheless that we have to pay. The Lifetime ISA account is another great savings product in my opinion, which can be used for the following two reasons. Firstly, to help first-time buyers purchase their first home, and secondly, for those looking to save for later in life to support their retirement goals. But there are a couple of different rules around ISAs that you should be aware of. You must be under the age of 40 to open one, and once done so, you can put in £4,000 per tax year or £333 and some change per month. Any deposits made, the government will also top up by 25%, up to a maximum benefit of £1,000 per year. It's a great savings mechanism for first-time buyers because when done so with a partner, you can benefit from having two individual ISA accounts. When you're at the point of buying a house, all you'll need to do is to inform your solicitors that you have two ISA accounts that you would like to use. The downside here is that the value of the property that you can buy using a ISA account is capped at £450,000. Now, obviously, that's an expensive first home by any stretch. However, it's also worthwhile bearing in mind that the average age now for a first-time buyer is now kind of early 30s, where I guess people are a little bit more established in their careers and earning slightly more money. And when you combine that with the fact that banks are now also offering 95% mortgages, that could possibly present a little bit of a problem for some first-time buyers out there, but certainly not all. For those that do own a home already, though, the LISA can still be used to save up until age 60, where you can withdraw that money completely free of any penalties. The only downside being you can only pay into the account up to age 50, where the government will also stop adding that additional 25% bonus. And essentially you can't touch that money for a further 10 years without incurring a penalty, which would be the 25% bonus that the government gave you. So it's a good account, but it does mean that your money's kind of locked up for quite a substantial period of time, so it's just something to bear in mind. When I eventually have a child, one of the first things that I will do for them is set them up with a junior stocks and shares ISA account. After all, if there's one thing that a newborn baby has in abundance, it's time, which means that over the course of the next 18 years, I can invest money on their behalf and let that money compound. Even if I just invested 50 quid a month into a well-diversified global index fund tracker of some sort, earning an average rate of return of 7.5% per year, and I increase that amount with inflation at about 3% a year, by the time that my child hits 18 years old, I could hand over to them £28,083 completely tax-free to do whatever they want with. This could help with university fees, buying their first car, or perhaps even just putting to one side for a deposit for their first home when they're ready. And if I gave them that money, which went into an adult stocks ISA, and just let it compound for a further 7 years without them touching it or without me putting in a penny more, then it would compound to £47,395, which would definitely put them in a better position for getting on the property ladder at an age which is probably a little bit more suitable. In summary though, doing this will give them a little bit of a leg up financially as they enter into adulthood. So for me, it's something that I think is more than worth the £50 a month to help them out that little bit further. Now, if you're still figuring out your own investment portfolio though, it might be worthwhile you watching this video next, where I share with you all of the things that I've learned from over 2,850 days worth of investing. So be sure to click on that video next, and with that being said, I'll see you over in the next one.